Hello, this is a mini lecture discussing the topic of alternation of generations. This is an important concept when we talk about plant biology because we see the change in alternation of generations and the Gametophyte and the Sporophyte in these different major groups of plants. So understanding how it evolved and how it changed is really important. It's a concept that is often a little bit difficult to understand because this life cycle and this process is so different than our own. And so I'm going to walk you through it a little bit, and then we're going to look at the major groups in both Protists, also in land plants, and look at how this changes throughout the evolution of land plants. So if we look at alternation of generations here, as shown here in this diagram, we see that there's both a haploid part of the life cycle and a diploid part of the life cycle. For the most part, when you're in the diploid life cycle, you're thinking about the sporophyte, or you're observing the sporophyte. That is the diploid part. Yes, the zygote is also diploid when it comes together. It's going to be quite small, so you won't necessarily be able to see it when you go out in nature, but that will grow through mitosis into the sporophyte. So those are really the only diploid parts. But that sporophyte will then go through meiosis to produce these things called spores, and those spores will go through mitosis to produce gametophytes. And those gametophytes can be male or female, and they will produce either male or female gametes, which will then once again go through that fusion. What you also want to note is that spores can also be predetermined to be male or female, so you may have heterospory or homospory. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this mini lecture. So I like to think about it like if I was going through alternation of generations myself. So if humans went through alternation of generations, as you can see here in this picture, if humans were to go through that, like you and I, that would mean that there were these two different forms. There is the sporophyte, which would be what we are, diploid, and we would go through meiosis. But instead of producing gametes, we would produce these things called spores. So they might look like little, little objects that we put out into the environment. And then they would grow into what is a gametophyte. So imagine that there's these other kinds of humans running around that are a haploid form of us. Maybe they're smaller, maybe they look just like us, but they're a little bit different. And these are gametophytes, and they're going to produce either, if they're a male gametophyte, sperm, or a female gametophyte, gametes. And they're going to do this through mitosis because they're already haploid. And then once that happens, those sperm and those eggs will be united in or go through fusion into a zygote, and then through mitosis that zygote will grow into what is a sporophyte that looks like me or you. And so that is this concept of how it's different. Imagine that there's this different form. And you might say, or you might ask yourself, why the heck would we have two different forms? Like, what's the point? And so that is a really good question, and that's something important to discuss. So all land plants undergo alternation of generations, but it does have some advantage. Diploid multicellular sporophytes can make many more spores via meiosis than a single diploid zygote can. So you can produce a lot more offspring. That's important, right? Especially when we're talking about some of the early plants. Spores produced on land are easily dispersed through wind currents and can travel long distance from the parent plant. In order to survive, you might need to get really far away from your parent so you're not competing with them, as well as the fact that there's a bit of bet hedging potentially in there. And bet hedging just means if I get my spores into all these different environments, I have a better chance of them surviving. Spores are also tougher than gametes, and so they're not vulnerable to desiccation. And desiccation means drying out. And so if you think about early life on land, that might have been a major thing that you needed to protect yourself from. Also think of early protists as well, which were much more used to having the advantage of being in a moister environment. So you want to think about those as some major advantages to alternation of generation, but also to having a sporophyte produce spores instead of you and I who produce gametes directly. So we see alternation of generations in the protists. So here's a picture of the protists. So I'll get my face out of the way here. And you can see that in many cases, if we look here, we have dinoflagellates, which are super cute, and diatoms here, the little pill boxes. And what you see is that they really don't look that different, whether they're haploid or they're diploid. This shows you the haploid part, and this shows you the diploid part, which is right here in the fertilization. And so what's interesting about it is that there's not very much difference here. When you look as well here between the diploid part right here and the haploid part, they look really similar to each other. So you might not be able to tell them apart. But there are some other cases if you look at other protists. So here's another example. This is Ectocarpus. This is a brown algae. And you can see they also don't really look that different from each other, okay? You can see this Sporophyte right here and these Gametophytes, and they look really similar to each other. The difference is their structures that they have located on them on whether they produce gametes or spores. And here's another example of alternation of generations in Lemuria. And in Lemuria, you can see that we also have quite a different looking Sporophyte to the Gametophyte here. And once again, these things are also very limited to the environments that they can be in. They're in moist environments, and we're using primarily water, right, to disperse these spores. And that's super efficient to do, is to throw your spores out in the water and let them get into a new environment to settle and then produce the gametes and gametophytes, or gametophytes and then gametes. Here is another picture. This is a green algae closely related to land plants, and you can see that only the zygote is diploid in this case. So there's going to be a lot of different evolutionary experiments on how alternation of generation changes throughout the different parts of, or different types of plants. And here's another one where this shows you once again this idea of alternation of generations in a figure from your book, where you can see then where you have here your Sporophyte here and here your Gametophyte. They look quite different. Sporophyte producing spores, Gametophyte producing two different kinds of gametes that fertilize and then go through the process again. It's important to remember a few little things about that, is that in non-vascular plants, so in your non-vascular, your mosses, etc., that you're going to see that the Sporophyte is small and short-lived and very dependent on the Gametophyte for nutrition. So it's a Gametophyte-dominated life cycle. In ferns and other vascular plants, what you're going to see is that the Sporophyte becomes much larger and longer-lived than the Gametophyte, and that it's a Sporophyte-dominated life cycle. So we see this change through plant evolution, and this is a very important change in terms of success in the long term for these different types of plants. So let's walk through the different types of organisms that we are looking at and think about what is the Gametophyte and what is the Sporophyte. So here is an example of our mosses. So you can see them here. And you can see the Sporophyte here is on top of the Gametophyte. So when you go out to the forest and you see a nice little bed of moss, most of the time you're looking at the Gametophyte. And only part of the year or part of the time when the conditions are right, you'll see the Sporophyte. So if you get down really low and you look at it, you might see the little Sporophyte on top. So that Sporophyte is here. But when we get to ferns, you can see, so we're already now into vascular plants, you can see that our mature Sporophyte is here. And this shows you the Gametophyte is this heart-shaped structure here below, and the Sporophyte grows on top of it. And so this is the side view, and this shows you it again here with your Gametophyte, okay? And then you have sperm with the Antheridia, and the Archegonia, you produce your egg. And now, so we have a Sporophyte here, and then if we go on to see, look at our gymnosperm, so what you know as your conifers and other pines, then you can see that a mature Sporophyte is the whole tree. So we're now very large relative to the Gametophyte. And then finally, when we get to this, to our angiosperms, you can see that really the Sporophyte then is essentially the mature Sporophyte is that whole structure here as well. So you have the whole organism being the Sporophyte. If we go and look now back to the same thing, but now think about what the Gametophyte looks like. Here you can see in a Gametophyte-dominated life cycle, They're quite large. They're pretty much equal in size to our sporophyte. And here you can see this is what a moss gametophyte looks like. And if we look at it in ferns, once again, the gametophyte is here. If we go to look at our flowering plants and our pines, in our pines, it is now reduced down in the case of a male gametophyte to the pollen grain, and inside is where the sperm is. And inside the female, it's going to be that little scale that's on the cone. Not the cone is not our gametophyte, but actually in the scale, we're going to have the megasporangia with that egg in there. So really, it unites inside of that little scale thing here, and that's where we get the development and the fertilization, the embryo, and then eventually the seed that looks like those little seeds you're familiar with. And with angiosperms, then it's so reduced that it's essentially inside of the ovule here of the flower. So then you see the egg is in there, and we have our female gametophyte inside here, and our pollen grain is our male gametophyte here. So all of that now happens inside here within the flower. Okay, and then it's self-contained within that flower. It's also important to pay a quick nod to heterospory versus homospory. So heterospory is the production of two distinct types of spores by different structures. And all non-vascular plants and most seedless vascular plants are homospores. So they produce single types of spores. Spores can develop into bisexual gametophytes that produce both eggs and sperm. And here's just another example of that. Another example that shows you what's shown in your book, that here you have non-vascular plant and most seedless vascular plants are homospores, so they have a sporangia that produces spores, which produces a bisexual gametophyte producing both of them. Seed plants, right, are gymnosperms and are angiosperms that have seeds. They have microsporangia and megasporangia, which produce either the male or the female gametophyte, respectively. Okay, so they're slightly different. All right, so that should wrap up trying to sort of think about alternation of generations. I hope that helps, and I appreciate your time. And I say thank you for watching, and please let me know if you have any more questions. Thanks so much. Have a good rest of the day.